certainly, my dear brothers and sisters, it is necessary to understand what we are, the state in which we find ourselves, and the work we must do on ourselves if we truly want a radical and definitive change. Much has been said about hypnotism. In other times, it was considered that this science was the heritage only of people who were dedicated to sorcery, witchcraft, etc. Today is already in the university and is studied as hypnology, but it is the same hypnotism, only renamed. Now, instead of simply being called hypnotism, it is given the pompous name of hypnology, but it is the same. Surgical operations are even performed with the patient in a state of hypnosis, and I think that in the Soviet Union, many such experiments are being carried out. But there is something very interesting in all this, and it is really the concrete fact that people do not realize that they live in a continuous hypnotic state. People only come to know about hypnotism when they have gathered and when a hypnotic session is carried out, etc. Everywhere we see signs of hypnotism, magnetism, suggestion, etc., but the crowds ignore that they are precisely in a continuous hypnotic state. Such a state is due to that sinister force of the abominable Kundabuffer organ. We have talked a lot about this organ, and it is worth reminding you that in a very remote past, such an organ was introduced into humanity. Then it developed in the same way that the tail of the monkeys appears. Thus, there was a time when humanity possessed such a tail. I have explained to you many times that it was necessary to introduce this organ into the human species with a definite purpose. It was nothing less than establishing a certain stability in the geological layers of the earth. Since the human organism is a machine that captures certain types of energy, it is clear that, upon receiving such an organ, there was a modification in the geological layers of the Earth as a consequence of the alteration of the human machine. Thus, the modified type of energy could, collectively, give stability to the geological crust of our world because the human machines transmit to the interior layers of the Earth the types of energy that they transform. The energy, transformed in this way, could give stability to the geological crust of our world. When the ineffable beings considered that such an organ was no longer necessary, they eliminated it from the human species. Unfortunately, as I have already insisted many times, the bad consequences of the abominable Kundabuffer organ remained within our organism. Those terrible consequences came to be constituted in the form of the ego, the I, the myself, the self-willed. Thus, the consciousness remained engrossed, embedded within the ego. Now, it is obvious that the essence, the consciousness, bottled up within the ego is processed by means of its condition. Since the ego is subjective because it is the outcome of error, the consciousness bottled up within the ego, it is processed subjectively in a state of hypnosis, it sleeps profoundly. Thus, the state of unconscious snoozing in which humanity lives is due to the fact that the consciousness is bottled up within the ego, and since the ego is the outcome of the abominable Kundabuffer organ, we can draw as a consequence or corollary that the hypnotic sleepy state of the consciousness is due to the abominable Kundabuffer organ. Extending this, then, to the community, we could say that the multitudes are hypnotized by the sinister force of the abominable Kundabuffer organ. In making this statement, we speak accurately. The curious thing about this case is that people do not realize that they are hypnotized. They only come to know of hypnotism when that force is concentrated in one place, that is, in a hypnotic session, for example. Millions of human beings, then, live in a state of hypnosis, and that is always unfortunate. Let's see, sister. Disciple, venerable master, hypnosis applied to the knowledge of medicine, can it be negative? Samael Aun Weor, well, sometimes it serves to cure, sometimes with hypnotherapy, some cures are performed with the hypnotic force, that's obvious. Disciple, master, I had read in a yoga book, specifically Raja Yoga, that hypnosis, in any case, is extremely negative because it brings consequences to the brain. That it is as if a blow were given to the mind of a person when through hypnosis makes him change his mind, that is, something he didn't want. Samael Aun Weor, hypnotism is harmful to humanity. When an active subject is hypnotizing a patient, it is obvious that he introduces into the mind, into the subconsciousness of the patient's brain, his own hypnotic fluids. Then, from that moment, the patient is thus under his control, that is, the victim remains enslaved by the hypnotist, which is why it is harmful. However, in medicine they use hypnosis to perform some cures and have even been able to perform surgical operations and have been able, for example, to replace anesthetics, well, in some cases. But considering all of this, hypnosis is not recommended. Disciple, thank you, Master. Samael Aun Weor. Undoubtedly, the first concerns that arose regarding hypnotism arose due to something that, we could say, was relatively innocuous. It happened that in a convent, a nun constantly fell into a hypnotic trance. She had her confessor and had no problem telling him that she still kept the portrait of a lover she had had, and that when she looked at that portrait, she always fell into a hypnotic state. That priest-confessor proposed to help her, and certainly he asked her to bring her portrait. There was nothing strange about that portrait. The only thing that really attracted attention was that such painting, the frame rather, contained some very shiny stones. That confessor then managed to convince a scientific friend to accompany him in such investigations. He knew perfectly well that when looking at the portrait, the nun did fall into a state of hypnosis or a hypnotic trance. Properly, that trance was provoked when she looked at certain very bright stones that were in the frame. The curious thing about the case is that they say that she assumed an attitude, well, rather erotic, like that of a woman who was on her honeymoon during the sexual trance, etc. So it was something strange. Continuing with the investigations, it was concluded that all kinds of very bright objects, bright stones charged with magnetism, can produce hypnotic trance states in very psychic people. Much later, due to this incident, there was no shortage of people in Europe who magnetized very bright objects, shiny stones, etc. to induce the hypnotic sleep state in certain patients. And that was how, for some centuries now, hypnotism began to be used in medicine. However, I remember that among the most famous researchers of hypnotism is this Richard Charcot, Cesar Lombroso, etc. The first one who bothered to seriously investigate this hypnotism was an Englishman and Mr. Charcot. That Englishman, frankly, had rather the properties of the Hasnamussen. As for Charcot, he was just a mama's boy, as they say around there. Indeed, his investigations are not worth studying, since everything he said was correct, according to his mama. He was a very spoiled mama's boy, but indeed there is nothing really serious about him. He never delved into the problem of the universal hypnotic force. So those two most important researchers, an Englishman who was the one who had properties of the Hasnamussen and the mama's boy, as they called Charcot, they did not discover anything important. They did not go beyond doing simple silly experiments. But as a consequence or corollary of all this, different kinds of researchers began to emerge here, there, and everywhere. Wherever mediums abounded, spiritism arose, which later gained great strength with the event of the Mrs. Fox of Merville, where the tables were raised in the air, where the stones entered through one window and came out through another, where a certain entity called Katie King materialized, etc. The world was shaken by hypnotism and spiritualism, and that gave rise, rather, to the appearance of many spiritualist-type schools. It is worth remembering the Anthroposophical school, Theosophism, Pseudo-Rosicrucianism, Pseudo-Yogism, and countless schools that flourished as a consequence of all of that. In general, all these schools, together with hypnotism and its henchmen, came to give the Western world a rather dark type of force, because it was certainly how the Kalkian personality emerged, let's say, the personality from Kali Yuga, right? That fatal personality. Thus, on the one hand, a certain natural innate religiosity disappeared, the patriarchy disappeared to be replaced by the Kalkian personality, that is, the personality of Kali Yuga. It is not my intention now, let us say, to criticize so many institutions that exist in the world, but speaking honestly with my heart as they say, in my hand, I discover that many schools, well, are not on the real path.